Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Matthias Wetzel. I'm a professor and teacher here at the Department of Financial and Economic Law here at Asia University. And today, in the next couple of minutes, I want to give you a brief little overview of the syllabus and of the content of my lecture, International Trade Law, now in this spring semester. Actually, this class is entirely EMI, so it's entirely taught in English. And the topics covered within this lecture are, first of all, starting with a little introduction into what is basically the subject of international trade law, so what belongs to this area, as it is very huge and vast, and in the following actually limiting this with a particular focus to the laws and agreements within the framework of the World Trade Organizations of the WTO. This is accompanied by a brief historical overview, which is themed so from bilateral trade agreements towards a multilateral liberal trade order, so basically contrasting the situation as it was before the Second World War, with predominantly trade agreements done rather on a bilateral basis, and then after the Second World War, the transition to a liberalized or a more liberal trade order, which is based on a multilateral fundament. Actually, I will give a little background about how this system came into existence. So with the Havana Conference in the end of the 1940s, and its most important decision actually to adopt the so-called GATT agreements, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in its version of 1947. I will also talk about the then at this time failed attempt to establish an international trade organization, for which the time was not yet fit, so which needed another 40 years before then the WTO finally came into existence. We will jump over to the Uruguay round negotiations starting in the mid of the 1980s and lasting until 1994, which finally climaxed and culminated in the Marrakesh Declaration, which actually brought the WTO as we know it today. With this background information, I will further explore in the next chapter the objectives and functions of the WTO, as notably outlined in the preamble of the WTO agreement, as well as Article 3. So first and foremost, of course, promoting trade negotiations and deals among its various members. Also then, in case an agreement is reached, the administering of these trade agreements, but also, which came as a notable improvement with the WTO agreement of 1994, the establishment of an dispute settlement instrument and dispute instrument boards, which actually greatly improved the situation, which was known under the old GATT 1947. And finally, also as it comes to the objectives and functions, also the close cooperation with other international organizations in that field, for naming just a few, for example, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, but also, for example, the World Intellectual Property Organization, as regards, for example, topics that interfere with the TRIPS agreement within the WTO. In the next chapter, which heading is the WTO legal framework, I will give an overview about the legal structure of the WTO, notably as regards the substantive laws, the main substantive agreements which are part of this framework. So notably the so-called multilateral agreements, as they are in detail, the GATT 1994. So the revision that came into force with the adoption of the WTO agreement, the GATS, so the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which was then newly added in 1994, TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, and the DSU, which I already briefly mentioned, the Dispute Settlement Understanding. And of course, next to these compulsory framework of multilateral agreements, which is binding for every WTO member, of course, also the so-called plurilateral agreements, which give some space and leeway for member states to reach additional, on a voluntary basis, to reach additional, also maybe regional agreements, which address certain additional aspects of trade between these the participating member states. Following this, I will actually enclose a detailed discussion of the three major multilateral agreements, as notably the GATT 1994. So first explaining in detail, also with, of course, quoting examples, the fundamental principles, as they are notably the so-called most favored nation principle, the national treatment principle, but also the tariffs-only principle. And also at the same time actually explaining the various areas which are to more or lesser extent are exempted from those principles for certain reasons, and so the exceptions that are actually existing also under this agreement. So these fundamental principles, of course, in principle, apply in a very similar way also to the GATS, so to the General Agreement on Trade and Services. So that's why here I keep my explanation a little bit shorter, as far as the main principles are similar, and only basically address the differences. So what is actually different from the GATT? Finally, I talk about TRIPS, and notably its particular importance in the context of the WTO system. So the attempt that you have next to the harmonization of the laws for obtaining certain IP rights, also for the first time the attempt to somehow address the question of harmonizing enforcement of IP rights. But I will also particularly talk about the importance of this agreement for Taiwan, as Taiwan being a member of the WTO, but not of the other, for example, a lot of other international organizations such as WIPO. So basically, the TRIPS, for example, acts as a linkage to these other international agreements in the field. So it's of paramount importance, of course, also for Taiwan. So this for a brief little overview of this lecture. If you have further questions, please do not hesitate to contact me and to ask. Of course, I'm happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.